Okay, good morning. We're going to get started. I asked Dr. Benitez to lead us in the pledge.
Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Dr. Benitez. Can't believe after 15 years sitting in new chairs, I'll tell you, that's amazing. We welcome those that are here for purposes of addressing the board at the proper time and in the proper order of their request. For those who have not already submitted a request, we have provided forms in the back of the room and also have additional copies here in front at the Assistant Secretary's position. If you wish to speak during the meeting, please fill out a form indicating your name and the agenda item which you wish to address. You may also make a request to give testimony on an item not listed for discussion today. However, full discussion on any items not listed on the agenda will have to be delayed until such a time as the item can be publicly posted in advance as a regular agenda item. If you wish to ask questions, please ask them to the chair and not to individual members of the board or to the staff. The board has been meeting in closed session regarding matters listed on today's closed session agenda and wishes to report that no reportable actions were taken. Okay, we're going to call on our first, well, let me see, Pledge of Allegiance, public testimony. Oh, okay. Public testimony on items listed on today's agenda, do we have none? Okay. Public items on items not listed, we don't have any. And we'll go right into our first presentation, but before we do, I want to just acknowledge Trustee Doug Otto, who's sitting here, trustee of the Long Beach Community College District. Good morning, Doug. LCAP and SBAC, Robert.
Dr. Williams, should we make a quick announcement that we're live streaming?
Oh, thank you, Juan.
Today? Yeah.
You already did it. Thanks, Juan.
Thanks to Ray and the OMS crew.
I forgot. Yeah.
Mostly the crew.
Good morning, President Williams, members of the board, executive staff, and members of the community. It's always a privilege and a pleasure and an honor for me to present the progress that the district has been making over the course of the past year and multiple years regarding our local control and accountability plan, as well as our performance in the Smarter Balance assessments. This particular presentation is a team effort. I'm doing it alongside Dr. Christy Kale. So we'll be tag teaming at various points throughout this presentation. But the slides and the data have been put together by our research office, led for the past several years by Dr. Christopher Lund, and now under the supervision and leadership of Dr. Kale. So before we even begin, I wanted to acknowledge all of their hard work and efforts. Dr. Kale has a particular slide that will acknowledge individual members of her staff, but I wanted to make sure that we start off by sending kudos out to the members of the fourth floor. It also behooves me to mention that our stakeholders have given so much feedback to us on a qualitative basis as well. So a lot of what you'll hear today and this morning reflects some of the analysis that we've done with our District Community Advisory Committee, our District English Learner Advisory Committee, and multiple other stakeholder groups throughout the entire school system. So we really try to enrich the context and the content of our slides with a lot of the feedback that we receive from those whom we serve. Most of this presentation is an extension of what the superintendent presented at the management team meeting yesterday. So in many respects, it's going to extend some of the data that you've already seen. It's going to allow us to do a deeper dive into some of the subgroups. But it also allows us to frame the data within the context of our LCAP. And our LCAP, as you know, just like all LCAPs in the state, has 8 priority areas, including basic services, the state standards, parent involvement, pupil achievement, etc. This particular presentation is going to focus predominantly on pupil achievement, and then tomorrow's presentation is going to focus predominantly on pupil engagement and school culture and climate. But these are the areas where we've got the most recent data, and so we want to make sure that we present the data to the board and to the community. There's a lot of content to cover, as you're well aware. What we want to do is try to break it down into these categories, which reflect the main metrics that are associated with our accountability here in the state of California, as well as our local indicators. They are going to be broken down into the various categories associated with unduplicated pupils in the LCAP, meaning our low-income students, our English learners, and our RFEP students, our foster youth, but also other subgroups that are of interest to our community. So we want to make sure that the board and the community understand that we're going to try to do as much of a deep dive as possible. But we are also trying to keep this as concise as possible. So if there are any questions as to various subgroups or how individual students are performing at individual schools, you can let us know, and we can try to dig deeply into those as well. But we are trying to honor everyone's time, too. So let's start with the first SBAC category, which is our English language arts. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this particular metric because it helps us to frame the subsequent metrics that we cover. It's going to follow the same pattern. In other words, we're going to take a snapshot of the district's overall performance, and then we're going to break it down into ethnic subgroups, and then we're going to break it down into other subgroups of interest, and then we're going to try to contextualize the data, and then we're going to follow that same routine throughout the course of our presentation. So this will help us to really understand how the district is performing. And at various points, there are going to be celebrations, there are going to be some shortcomings, and I think that makes for a healthy dialogue for us as a community here in Long Beach. So first, with ELA, you'll see in this bar graph under 2019 that 54% of our students met or exceeded the standards in English language arts. That represents a 3 percentage point increase from 2018 when we were at 51%. That meets our target, our annual target that we've set forth in our LCAP, which is 3% every single year. In fact, when you look at this chart, you'll note that for the past 4 consecutive years, we've hit our target. So it's been 3% growth every single year since 2015. When we look at the data broken down by grade level, we'll note that all of our grade levels saw growth. Some obviously more than others. For example, 3rd grade, there's a 4 percentage point increase. 4th grade is a 2 percentage point increase. 5th grade, 4 percentage point increase, etc. One thing that the board will probably recognize is that now all of our grade levels are at 50% or higher, which is the first time that is indeed the case. Now we break things down by ethnicity. This is where we really start looking at closing the achievement gap. You'll note that in addition to displaying the performance for African American students and for Hispanic students, as well as for Asians and whites, based on feedback from the community, we've also broken down the data by our Cambodian subgroup, by our Filipino subgroup, by our Pacific Islander subgroup, and by those who state that they represent 2 or more ethnic groups. Now,
Robert, can I just interject for one second?
Sure.
Just a point of clarification. I don't know if it's later in the slides, but one suggestion I would have is if we could get a transition slide before we go into the subgroups, just to give us a sense of what the district numbers are for each of the subgroups. Right. so that we can contextualize each subgroup, right? So what percentage are Latino, what percentage are African American, low income, foster?
Sure.
I apologize if it's later in the presentation.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you bring up a good point in terms of.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. I think it would be good.
Yeah, I don't know what the exact number is, so if it's not, we'll get it to you, so
Okay.
we can do that for the board.
Yeah, just so we can see that snapshot, so that when we look at this slide with the subgroups,
Yes.
that we know what percentage of our district is of each of these groups. Thank you, Robert. Sorry for
Yeah.
the interruption.
No problem. I actually, you bring up a really good point in terms of the size of the subgroups, because
Right.
that's what we're trying to understand. So for example, the Asian subgroup here also contains the Cambodian subgroup, so that's important to note. Cambodians make up, the sample size here for Cambodians is 1,803 students. Asians overall, 2,539. And the Pacific Islander subgroup is a smaller subgroup, 473. So it is important to note, actually, when we look at, for example, a decline in Pacific Islander performance, the 4 percentage point slide is going to look different in terms of the actual number of students. So a 4 percentage point slide is going to be roughly 20 students. And so when you have a much smaller subgroup, shifts in performance or movement in categories by individual students is going to be determined significantly by how large that population is. So in this particular case, just 20 Pacific Islanders moving into a different category has shifted the performance for that subgroup by 4 percentage points in terms of a reduction. So it's important to note that.
And Robert, before you move on, so on percentage-wise, for example, African-American and Caucasian are about the same in the district, 13%.
Right.
Hispanic is around 55%. Asian is around 5 to 6%, and all the other subgroups are around 1%. So as Robert said, the Pacific Islander subgroup is very small as a system, and you can have, big changes real fast.
Yeah, the other piece of that is also when we look at, for instance, declining enrollment rates, how that's impacting if we have certain groups that are either declining disproportionately and or increasing. That way the data over years can also be contextualized that way.
Yes, that's a good point. We'll see that actually play out when we look at AP enrollment, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
And in terms of the performance here by subgroup, while it is important to note that maybe 20 Pacific Islander students shift from nearly met, which is at the borderline of meeting or exceeding the standards, to another category, we do pay attention to every individual student. So we care that there is a decline there, and we want to make sure that is addressed. But in totality, we see here 8 specific subgroups, and we see that 6 of the 8 subgroups saw an increase, including among our African Americans and among our Hispanics. In fact, when you look at African Americans, they've had their second consecutive year of 3% growth, which is a celebration for our district. Hispanics, they had their second consecutive year of 4% growth, and actually their fourth consecutive year of at least 3% growth. So note that for Hispanics in 2015, they were at 33%, and this year they're at 48%. So a pretty rapid increase for that subgroup. And as a consequence, we see over the past year the achievement gap narrowing between our African American and our Caucasian students. So last year, the African American and white achievement gap was 39%. This year it's 37%, so it's narrowing slightly. The Hispanic white achievement gap narrows by 3 percentage points. So it's movement in the right direction, even though, of course, naturally we would want to see continued acceleration of that narrowing. And then, again, we want to point out that based on stakeholder feedback, particularly in June during the public hearing, members of the community wanted the Cambodian subgroup broken out. And so we present that data here, and we see that 66% of Cambodians are meeting and exceeding standards in English, which represents a 4 percentage point increase. And actually the 4th consecutive year of growth for that subgroup, which is a tremendous accomplishment for them. But it does continue to raise some questions for our system in terms of challenging ourselves to continue to improve. because we established a pretty aggressive 5 percentage point increase in all of our lowest performing subgroups. So we can see already that's a really high and aggressive target. And we accomplished that for those who represent 2 or more ethnic groups, but it's still an area of growth for us, even as we celebrate the progress that we're making. And we want to continue to make sure that we honor that goal. Looking at other specific subgroups, here we include breakdown by gender, female and male. We include our homeless foster youth. Low SES represents our low-income students. Special education students, English learners. Ever EL category, which includes our English learners and our RFEP students. And then Gate Excel students as well. And you'll see that among these 8 subgroups, 7 of them saw gains. There's a decline in the English learner performance here in ELA, but Dr. Kale is going to describe in detail exactly what's happening there, because I think that's an important area that needs to be contextualized, since that subgroup shifts and moves sometimes during the middle of the year. We'll note here that low-income students had the highest gains at 4 percentage points. So last year, 43% of our low SES students met or exceeded standards in ELA. This year, it's 47%. That's a very encouraging sign. Our homeless and foster youth students, as well as our special education students, also grew by 3 percentage points. So here again, it's important to try to understand exactly where the district's overall 3 percentage point growth has been coming from, and a lot of it has been coming from some of our subgroups that had historically struggled.
Robert?
Yes.
There's just 2 categories here, English learners, EL, and Ever, EL plus RFEP. What's the distinction between the 2?
This is something Dr. Kale is going to discuss in greater detail, but it includes both students who are currently English learners and those who have been reclassified.
Okay.
So they were previously English learners and have been reclassified out of that subgroup. But because they come with the background of having been an English learner, we wanted to make sure we track their progress as well. And it's also part of the LCAP's accountability system for us to note how they perform.
All right, good morning.
Good morning.
So we have 105 slides to share with you of data, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to do this in a way that honored all of the work that came before, but we had some additional slides we wanted to share. So in your addendum, you're going to find some slides that I may refer to once in a while, meaning letting you know that they're there, but we're not going to present them and we aren't going to go over them, but we wanted to honor that same information. A lot of it you received at the managers meeting. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about some of the celebrations. We had 8 schools with a 10% overall gain and 27 schools with 5% overall gain in looking at our SBAC in ELA. And those are some great celebrations for us. In addition, when we look at cohort gains, we see multiple schools with 10% or 5% cohort gains. Keeping in mind cohort gains is growth of the same students from one year to the next. So that's some really good data for us. We had 7 schools with 50% gap closure. And this is a really high mark to reach because our superintendent has said, look at your highest performing group and your lowest performing group and close that gap by 50%. So making that happen is really impressive data. And then I want to talk a little bit about the schools, the 17 schools who are in the Core Index 910 high growth group. This is a new metric for us this year. So Core has given us if you think of it in deciles, so taking all the schools in California and looking, not all the schools in California, but all the schools that are submitting data to CORE, which is the majority of the students in California, looking at that data and then lining it up and then carving it into 10 deciles. So 9 and 10 would be the highest. And looking at growth overall, we had 17 schools who essentially are way outperforming schools that look like them. So they're comparing like schools to like schools. So that is a really important metric. We had many schools also in the 7s and 8s. Anything above 5 says you're doing better than schools that are like you. So a great metric for us and something we're going to keep tracking on. We also saw 17 schools with 3 or more years of consecutive growth. Again, that's a really high target to meet. Sometimes, we have a little bit of growth one year, a lot of growth the next year, but to have above target growth 3 or more years in a row is really signs of some impressive work. All right. This is kind of fun data. When asking ourselves the question, how does our growth compare to other districts? These are the core districts that we use as our comparison points. Other large urbans that look a lot like us. And what you'll notice is Core District 4 has not yet reported their data, so we don't have comparative data for Core District 4. But taking Core District 4 out of it, what we can tell ourselves, or what we notice, is that we have the highest growth this district, or this year, above all the rest, and we've had a consistent growth over time. So 3% every year since the core group has been tracking these metrics. And that is not seen in any of those other districts. If you look since 2015, that is plus 12, which ties us for the highest 4-year growth rate among the core districts. So again, some exciting data there. All right, another important metric beyond SBAC that we look at is looking at our college prep exams, and we're talking right now about SAT in ELA. So this is the idea of how many of our seniors are meeting benchmark, meeting that 480 level. So it looks like this metric is improving, albeit slowly. We see a 3% growth in 2 years. So in comparison, some interesting comparison data, Robert shared with you that the 11th grade SBAC ELA has improved about 2% since 2015. So these metrics look pretty similar in comparison when you look at 8th grade, for example, improving 11%. So it suggests that we still have a little bit of work to do in this area. When we unpack it a little bit more, and we look at it by ethnicity, we aren't seeing necessarily a pattern of growth across all groups. However, a majority of the groups were up over 2 years, and a few of them are down slightly. So again, it's an area that we want to continue to look at. When we look at this same data by subgroup, we see essentially some small 2-year increases across subgroups, so that's some encouraging data. Our EL group looks a little bit flat, and our homeless and foster is slightly down. The male-female gap looks like it is persisting. So that's been persisting for us since about 2017. And as far as the English learner data, which appears like there's not much there, as Robert mentioned, I'm going to do some unpacking of that in greater depth. So I'm going to turn it back to Robert, who's going to take us in on the higher level as far as looking at the math data.
With performance in mathematics, we see again here a 3 percentage point growth for the district overall, which meets our LCAP goal target. It again marked the 4th straight year that the district rose by at least 3 percentage points, and by extension, the 4th straight year that the LCAP goal was met. When we look at it broken down by grade level, here we see that every grade level grew. Note in particular the growth in 6th grade and 7th grade, because when we think about a pipeline to high school, when we think about a pipeline to high school readiness, it's important to look at the grades that are coming up through the district's pipeline. And we note that there's been growth in 6th grade. It saw a 2 percentage point growth this year, the 4th consecutive year of gains for that grade level. And for 7th grade, it saw 5% growth, which is the 4th consecutive year of gains for that particular grade level. So a lot of great work happening at our middle school level, at least in terms of the SBAC math results.
Robert?
Yes.
Consistently, we see problems when our kids are leaving, going into the 6th grade. That's when we've always seen sort of a drop-off. They're leaving, where they've got one place where they go for everything, and then they get to middle school and they've got multiple classes that they have to go to, 7 periods. Perennially, we've always seen a drop-off, but I noticed in looking at the data, it looks rather good for that population of students who are migrating from elementary to middle school.
Yes, that's a really good point. You'll note that for 5th grade in particular, they're at 47% this year, and 6th grade is at 46%, so very little drop-off between the two. And of course, those are different cohorts of students, but it has been a focus of attention for us, all of the different transitions that our students experience, not only in mathematics, but in all areas of their academic learning, and not only between 5th and 6th, but also between 8th and 9th, and also between 12th grade and going to college or going into the world of work. So I think that gap that we tend to see amid student transitions is something that the school system has been paying very close attention to for several years now, and it's starting to pay dividends for us.
Let's just do what we do in 3rd grade for throughout everyone's educational career.
In terms of ethnicity, we'll see here again, 7 of the 8, actually all 8 subgroups had gains here, including African Americans and Hispanics. African Americans had their 4th consecutive year of growth, although the 2 percentage point increase this year is relatively more modest than the 3 percentage point gains of the previous 3 years. And then Hispanics had their 4th consecutive year of at least 4% growth, reaching 40% for the first time. And then again, Cambodians, we broke that subgroup out and saw that they had 4 percentage point gains. They reached 60% for the first time. And shifting over to the other subgroups, we see 7 of the 8 subgroups here seeing gains, with the homeless foster youth subgroup experiencing the highest gains at 6 percentage points. And it's their 2nd consecutive year of 6 percentage point gains in mathematics. Low-income students, again, rose by 3 percentage points, so it's their 3rd consecutive year of at least 3% growth.
Robert?
Yes.
I hate to make you go back, but if we could go back to math by grade level, for the grade 11, it says that there's a 1% increase, but I'm not seeing an increase in the numbers. Am I missing something?
It's rounding. Yes, so we've rounded it, but there is a slight decimal point, less than a decimal point gain there. So it amounts to roughly a 1 percentage point gain, but I would view that mostly as flat, because it's numerous student, it amounts to numerous students gains, but there's rounding going on there that's showing.
So that's what I was missing, was the rounding.
Yes, that's what it is.
Robert, you may have covered this in a previous slide. The 2 plus or decline, that's 2 or more races, ethnicity, and declined. What does that mean?
Declined to state.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
that's exactly it.
Okay.
Yep.
You know, when we talk about the numbers in that group, I know we've said in the past, or we've been told in the past, that the number of students who identify as 2 or more or decline to state is increasing. So I think having that information and that number, because that would impact the rest of the data in those other subgroups. So being able to say, I would make an assumption, I could be wrong, that in that 2 or more, especially if you were to separate that out from the decline to state, we would assume that those students are students of color, or could be students of color, or high probability students of color, which means that number came out of somewhere else.
That's right, yes.
And I do see that the 2 plus and the decline is on the higher end of achievement. So I think that's important to unpack for us at some point, just so we can have that.
That's a really good point, because as you note, if they are relatively more higher performing than the other subgroups, and they're coming from a subgroup that is historically underperforming, then it's going to depress the progress, or appears to depress the progress of those other subgroups.
Right.
So if, for example, there are 2 or more shifting from Hispanic or from African American to that subgroup, it's going to depress the progress that we might otherwise be seeing for that subgroup. Actually, comparable, Dr. Kale will explain this further, but that's a comparable situation with our English learners, because you're moving students out of one subgroup into another, and it's going to show a different result than we might otherwise be noting.
Right, so maybe in the future, we, at least if we can
That's a good
separate that
point.
out, maybe not in the 104 slides that we do here, but in another piece, just so that we have access to that as well. Just a visual would be great.
And then,
I would say the same for any overlap with our SES students, right? If the presumption is correct that these are
Right.
predominantly students of color, then our SES data is also impacted in the
Correct.
same way.
that's true.
All right.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
We like the data in this group, as you can tell, so
It is,
thank
it's
you.
really good. I mean, it enriches the conversation, and it reflects a lot of the conversation we're seeing throughout the community. So it's a really good discussion that this forum is allowing us to have.
Robert, I know you know the number, that's why I'm going to ask. Roughly, how many students are 2+ or declined?
I actually don't know that
Oh.
number.
And what's the methodological justification for including declined with 2 or more races?
I'm not sure what the provenance of
Okay.
that is.
Okay.
But maybe someone else in the room would know. I don't know. But we'll definitely look into that.
Thanks,
It's a growing group too,
Yeah.
so it is worth paying closer attention to. We saw the numbers broken out in terms of SBAC math by grade level, and here we are focusing particularly on 8th grade mathematics enrollment in algebra. And why algebra? Algebra performance in 8th grade tends to signify something positive for that student in terms of college readiness eventually. So it's been a longstanding district goal to try to ensure that as many 8th graders as possible are able to participate in 8th grade algebra.
I'm sorry, Robert, could you repeat that last point? I was amazed by the pen that
Sorry.
board member Purd just
No,
gave me.
no
I can
problem.
write on my black background with a silver Sharpie now. Sorry about that, Robert, just the last point that you
Oh,
made.
no problem. 8th grade algebra tends to be a signifier for college readiness down the line for that student. So we pay close attention to it, and we've had a longstanding goal in the district of trying to increase enrollment in 8th grade algebra. Although that doesn't necessarily reflect the student's performance in mathematics overall. Here, what we'll note is that 8th grade algebra enrollment inched slightly by a percentage point from 51% to 52%. Obviously, it's beneficial to see that growth, although it does fall short of our 3% annual target, which is a really aggressive target that we've set out for ourselves. But when you look at the totality of our 3-year LCAP, our goal for 2018-19 was actually 48% when we first started this journey 3 years ago. So we'd already exceeded that goal, actually as far back as 2015-16. So the gains that we had seen in previous years has allowed us to maintain being on track for this particular metric, even as the growth has slowed.
Robert, may I ask the criteria for a 7th grader to move on to algebra? What must he or she meet?
Chris, you have to be in 7th grade accelerated, and you have to pass that class with a C or higher to move into algebra. The only exception would be students that are in a Math 7 course that get an A or a B in that regular Math 7 course, and also meet or exceed on SBAC, or have a high GPA, generally 3.3 or higher, to be able to jump into accelerated.
So
I know
really,
it's fairly technical, but
really falls back to 6th grade and 5th
6th
grade
grade
beyond, doesn't
accelerated
it?
is the
Yeah.
predominant group. You're in 6th grade accelerated, you move to 7th grade accelerated, which then puts you in algebra.
And that's why if you look on that chart on the numbers below, it shows you that 54% of the 6th graders were in accelerated math, and then 7th grade, 55%.
Yeah.
So ideally, those students should be moving into algebra, plus any other students, like Dr. Lund just shared, that met the criteria.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point here in terms of 8th grade algebra. It's a lagging indicator, meaning most of the action or most of the work that we need to do is actually earlier in the pipeline for those students. And as the superintendent mentioned, we note that in 7th grade math accelerated enrollments at 55%. That is actually representing a 3 percentage point increase from last year. So last year was 52%, and this year it's at 55%, which is a positive indicator for long-term 8th grade algebra enrollment. For 6th grade, it actually increased from 49% to 54%. So we're seeing some movement in a positive direction in terms of what we may be seeing down the pipeline for 8th grade algebra enrollment.
Help me clarify once again. If I'm a 8th grader and do not take algebra, I must take it as a 9th grader, isn't that true?
Correct.
What are we doing for them in the 8th grade to prepare them for that?
Well, in the 8th grade, we have in our high need schools, they all have tutoring, Saturday programs, and so on. But we also have a bridge for all students going from 8 to 9 in a math bridge program. And we actually have it from 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12. So you can go to a bridge program to prepare you for the next class.
Excellent. That's so critical.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we've been doing that for about
Yeah.
5 years.
Here's
Just a broader question. So it appears that we, in many of our categories, are either meeting or exceeding the, whether it be 3% or 5%. At what point do we re-examine, to use your words, putting our goals up higher in those cases that for 3 or 4 consecutive years we're either meeting or exceeding the 3
It's going to be this year. So this year we'll be in a rewrite of our LCAP, which will include the rewrite of the goals. So we'll be looking at historical data and looking and bringing it back to you folks and bringing it to our parents and stakeholders, saying, here is what we're recommending, and to go forward from there.
Okay.
Here we see the 8th grade algebra enrollment data broken out by subgroup. And we would note here that there was a decline in enrollment for 8th grade algebra amongst our African American students and amongst our Hispanics. So while we saw some gains from those two subgroups in mathematics overall, their enrollment in algebra declined at least this year. So it is something that we want to make sure that we continue to pay very close attention to in terms of how it impacts particular groups of students. And we see as well here the breakdown in 8th grade algebra enrollment by subgroup, further elucidating some of the same points. We saw some increases among our male students, among our special education students, and among our low-income students. So those are pretty positive for them, although there is still that achievement gap that we want to make sure that we continue to pay very close attention to.
Robert, I know we've got the Math Collaborative at Jordan that we've had for a lot of years that we've spread to now Wilson and Cabrillo. But that has to build on a foundation that these numbers indicate may or may not be there for some of those students. And so it's a really heavy lift for those programs. I would love to see us consider, especially at those schools, potentially starting with Jordan just because they've had the longest program, really reaching down into the middle school level to see what kind of programs we could start as a prep for a student that we might target for the Math Collaborative as early as 6th grade in hopes of raising, especially for our African American male students, to just start that pipeline easier. It could be less of a lift for our high school programs if we start to reach down into the middle schools, and maybe we've got enough years under our belt of doing those programs that we might see some best practices that could be adapted at the middle school level to do that work.
Yes, that's a really good point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of celebrations in math, we're seeing some similar gains as in ELA, so this slide looks very similar to the ELA slide. I think the only thing that's not quite as dramatic is we don't have a number of schools with that 10% cohort growth, but we've been seeing such steady growth over time that it's not surprising to see that happen, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Again, we're seeing some impressive gap closure and 18 schools coming in at an index level of 9 or 10 on that core growth index, and again 12 schools having that 3 or more years of consecutive growth over time. So some celebrations, and again you have the list of schools in your addendum if you are curious as to which schools we're talking about. All right. So again, some comparative data by district. This is also some what I think is impressive data. So in math, we have the highest gains nearly every year that we've been tracking this data. So if you look at gains over time across all the core districts, we've got the highest gains nearly every single year. We have the highest gains overall, gains of 16% since 2015, which is also very impressive. What I think is really interesting is comparing ourselves to the two core districts that perform at a little bit higher level than us. So if you take a look at core district 3, we started 18 points behind core district 3, if you see that there. So we started at 30 in 2015 and they were at 48. So 18 percentage points behind them, and now we are only 5. So it's showing that we're, I mean, I know it's not a race, but it is.
Because it is a race, who are 3 and 5?
Well, that's offline.
Okay.
So again, and as you mentioned, Dr. Benitez, we see a similar pattern with core district 5, right? So starting out 9 points behind them and now catching up to 6. So we think that there's some really compelling data there showing we're closing the district gap if it were a race, which it is not.
Well, and before you move on, Dr. Carroll,
Yes.
I do want to add, the Bechtel Foundation gave money to our district and several of these districts here. Math in Common, it was a statewide initiative to support mathematics. And I just want to give a huge shout out to our folks here in Long Beach who did that, Pamela, Jill, and their teams, because as you can see from this data, we not only did well, but we outpaced the other Math in Common districts. This is really important when a foundation gives money because it's about track record, and this is about sustainability and about going to the future. So this is really a huge celebration, and it is a race because we are very competitive. But the beauty here is that we can share our best practices with these other districts too. So.
Ray, don't we have a 30-second delay on this that we can bleep out after the superintendent tells us?
All right. Let's see, where are we? So we're going to talk a little bit now about, we're going to go through the same pattern we did with ELA. So looking at college prep math exams, so specifically 12th grade benchmark on SAT, that is meeting a level of 530. And you can see that over time that's looking relatively flat, not much to talk about here with this data. In moving ahead and looking at this same data by ethnicity, again, we're seeing some groups showing a gain from last year, so some indication of some movement from last year, but again, relatively flat. In comparison, when we look at, when Robert was showing you the SBAC scores, 11th grade SBAC has risen 2% since 2015 in comparison to 8th grade, which is 12%. So it seems that high school math might be a continued focus area for us when looking at this data. When we take a look at it in terms of subgroup, so ELA, we saw some modest gains, but we look almost entirely flat here as far as math by subgroup on this SAT test. Something else that's maybe of interest. We don't see a male-female gap in performance in math like we do in ELA. So if you look here, you'll notice that we see sort of the same performance level. And that's sort of a curious number when it's compared to what we see in 8th grade algebra enrollment. So to recall what you saw in 8th grade algebra enrollment, you saw that 56% of girls were enrolled in algebra and 46% of boys. So it would suggest that those girls should continue with that same pacing in terms of their performance, but this data suggests that somehow by the time we get to 12th grade, we may be, so we may need to actually pay attention a little bit to that subgroup. My colleague Robert has been saying that we're going to unpack some EL data, so I'm going to do that next. So I'm going to give you a data slide break. So there's no data that no chart for you to look at on this slide, just sort of a stop and thinking about our English learners as a subgroup. So Robert mentioned several times, this is really the only subgroup where the kids move in and then out of it over time. Showing growth is a challenge. We have this target of 5% for every subgroup, and we never meet it, right? We don't meet it, and by the nature of the group and the way that we measure their progress, we will never meet it. So we wanted to present some data to look at, well, how are these kids doing based on what we do know? So looking at that -2 in ELA and looking at that -3 in math, it doesn't really tell the story. So I'm going to start with our usual reclassification data and then pull in some new data that will maybe help us understand what those numbers really mean. So let's start with the reclassification data. The first thing to notice is that we reclassified a whole lot of kids last year, right? You can see that. So a large increase. What is important to understand is that what it means to reclassified has changed because the test has changed over time, and the level at which, the threshold at which we determine you can be reclassified also changes over time. So if you look at 17-18, that was based on a year where we didn't have any CELT scores. So we had to do some internal work to determine reclassification rates. We did have LPAC data last year for the first time. The state did not give us any particular guidelines, so we chose to use moderately developed. So the the LPAC is scored in there's 4 bands, right? So think of it as 4, 3, 2, 1. So moderately developed would be that 3. And that's typically a cutoff point that we use on most exams to say you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, whatever that might mean. However, beginning next year, the state has said that we will all be using well-developed, which is a level 4. So what I'm telling you right now is that number 23 from last year is going to look very different next year. It's going to drop, but it's also probably going to drop for the state level. That's what we anticipate based on the higher threshold. So not only do our students have to meet a higher threshold on the exam itself is going to be scored a little bit differently. So I don't know if you recall, there was an EL presentation where you were showed a couple of items from the exam, right? So there was one exam and item, we call it talk about a scene. So you put a picture up, the students talk about what's happening in the picture, they describe it, and then they're scored. That is going to be given less weight this year, and what's going to be given more weight is what we call summarize an academic presentation. So that's where the students have to listen to an academic presentation and then summarize what they heard. A much higher academic challenge, that's going to count for more. So not only is the test going to be scored more stringently, there is a higher level for reclassification. So the reason I'm telling you all this is that reclassification data, it's hard to get a hold of, it's hard to look at from year to year, it's hard to use it as a determinant of progress. But we do look at it and it is important. But I just want to make sure we really understand what we're talking about. Yes.
Can I add, thank you. And I think that explanation highlights the complexity of contextualizing the data, right? So I would recommend that we take a deeper dive, not right now, because I know you have to, complete the rest of the presentation, but with two things that you hit on, Dr. Kale. And we've sort of inferenced the first one in other conversations that we've had. One is the stigma, the consistent stigma that's attached to our ELs as a lowest performing subgroup, right? So even again, the terminology, we talked about this EL, right? There's other things, emerging bilinguals, but attached to that, bringing more emphasis to sort of the assets of knowing more than one language, right? The seal of biliteracy that our district, grants. So that's kind of one set, right? The stigma attached to ELs, and particularly our long-term English learners. I think the other that I would love to be able to take a deeper dive into, either at a future meeting or I don't know how we could arrange this, Superintendent, the whole process of reclassification that you just highlighted, Dr. Kale. I think there's an opportunity here to look at other indicators of success, of educational success, whether it's by cohort because the test does change year to year, or the indicators is sort of a moving target, or some other way that's not so exclusively dependent on these arbitrary academic indicators, that we can highlight that these students are making progress, and that then we can track those support mechanisms that we do have in place, the best practices that may not show up consistently year to year because of the complexities that you just highlighted. So I want to emphasize both of those areas and to encourage our board to have a separate, deeper conversation in order to contextualize what you just did really good in 2 minutes, Dr. Kale.
Thank you.
Let me just add to that, because we're talking about SBAC here, but when we use SAT, do we see, when we talk about SBAC, we know that there's a different approach by students to taking the SBAC as opposed to the SAT. And I'm wondering if we looked at this under the same rubric with the SAT, might we see a lot different scores?
That would only really be for the 11th grade. The
11th
students in
grade.
grades 3 through 8 really
Yeah.
do take the SBAC seriously,
Right.
but we can analyze that data. And there's a great suggestion that we can take deeper dives on these items that you just all shared, because it is important to show the progress of our young people.
You know, as we plan our, I don't know what we're going to choose to focus on for our board field trips, but I was thinking the same thing, and I know we have really dedicated folks who are doing that reclassification work at school, so that might be an idea, is to spend some time and understand the process and really hear some stories behind how, because we know it's such an individualized event and moment that happens, and get some context from the folks who are doing that work. Might be something we can incorporate, and some students to tell their stories. Thanks.
Especially too at the high school level,
Right.
middle and high school level, where we're also getting a lot of new immigrant students at that time. So, you know, on the surface, folks would think, well, if they come here since elementary school and are in middle school and high school, the 11th grade scores shouldn't be what they are, right? So again, context is everything in this case.
Yes, clearly, and that's why we set up excuse me, some additional slides we're going to go over, because we're trying to really capture capture the progress that these students are making. We know a lot of people are doing a lot of work, and capturing it is really important. So I'll give you one more slide on reclassification, and then we're going to step out of this. So this is our cumulative EL reclassification rate for last year. Again, we know we reclassified a lot of students last year, so these numbers are going to look really nice. But what we're seeing here is think of all students who were ELs at some point, or excuse me, this represents all students who were ELs within the last 5 years of being in. Okay, I'm going to say it one more time. Can we rewind that tape? No. All right, I'm going to try it again. So this slide represents all of last year's English learners, those who had 5 or more years in the United States, whether or not they had reclassified, and this is their rate. So in 5th grade, you see 63% reclassified. By 8th grade, we added another 7%, and then by 12th grade, another 6%. So that left us with 24% of our students would have been in that long-term English learner category.
So to put it
again,
another way, Dr. Hill, just so I'm understanding you.
You can.
The reclassified by the 5th grade would presume that they started in kindergarten then?
Well,
so that they would
it
be
means that
reclassified by the 5th grade?
they've been in the United States for 5 years, so yeah. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Could have started in 1st grade too,
Okay.
if my math is correct.
And then reclass in 8th grade would mean the same, we would deduce the same, right? 5 years prior to that, that means they would have started at least by that grade, by 3rd grade.
Yes.
Okay.
And not necessarily with us for those 5 years.
Right,
So they
right.
could have only been with us for a year of those 5 years.
Exactly.
Okay.
You got it.
Thank you.
All right, so this is a new slide. What we're showing here is the blue represents October. So I want you to think about October, and this slide starts out with the 15-16 school year, and then it ends with last year. So the blue line represents October of that year, and those are the students who were English learners as of October. And what you see there is the percent who met or exceeded on SBAC and ELA. So again, you see 15%, then 15%, 18, and 19 as you move across those blue lines. Now next to them, that's the students who were left in the EL subgroup when they tested at the end of the year. So again, I'll say it again because I know we haven't really shared the data in this format. The blue bar is everybody who was an English learner at the beginning of the year in October. But remember what happens during the year to some of those kids. They leave the subgroup, right? They become reclassified. So by the time they take SBAC, they're not represented in that gray bar. So the gray bar is represented that -2, -3 number that we keep putting up. But that's because the English learners who were in that group at the beginning of the year are no longer in that group by the time they test. So what I want you to notice is the trajectory of those blue lines. So if we were to draw a line across those blue lines, what you can see is they're trending upward, and that's what we want to look for. We know that we are trending upward as a system. We want to make sure this group is trending upward as a system as well. So this is ELA, so let's see what it looks like in math. And again, in math, we see the same trend, right? And it's even a little bit steeper in math. So, I mean, to me, this is encouraging data, but it still relies on meeting or exceeding standards. So it means they still have to cross over that threshold. So growth of individual students is hidden in this data. You can't see that here. You only see those who moved across from one level to another. So, okay, so now I'm going to talk to you about growth, but I'm not changing the slide, and don't look at that next slide. So my notes are crazy. So I want you to have a conceptual understanding of what I'm going to talk about before I show you the data and have you look at it. It is a little bit complex, but once you get it conceptually, it makes a lot of sense. So here's the question. We know they're increasing, but are they increasing at a faster rate than the rest of the students, which would then suggest a closing of the gap, right? That's an important question for us to answer. So the core collaborative has analytics that they share with us. They give us access to these analytics, and it allows us to make a lot of different comparisons. And one of those comparisons is allowing us to pick a group and compare it to people not in the group, all right? So a lot of times what we do is we compare a group to the average, right? Or one group to another group. But what I'm going to be talking to you about is this group. So in this case, it's going to be English learners plus students who have been reclassified. So these are RFEPs with 4 or fewer years. That group of students in comparison to everybody who's not that group of students. Okay? So that's different from the data we've been sharing with you so far. So are you with me? It's that group compared to not that group. All right, so that's important. The second thing is we're not talking about meeting or exceeding in terms of overall students meeting that threshold. We're talking about scale score. So students receive a scale score, and there's what we call an average scale score. So the average scale score to meet the standard, that is going to be the line that they need to cross. So we're going to call that an above the line or a below the line. So meeting the standard, there's a scale score. All right, so stay with me. I'm almost there. So what I want you to do is now look at the slide, and if you look at 2015, at the bottom there, you're going to see that in 2015, our English learners, who plus our 4-year or less RFEPs, were 51 scale score points from meeting standard on average, all right? On average. So they were 51 points below that line that we want to reach. Our non-EL groups, meaning everybody else, were 4 points behind. So that's the gray dot you see on that same line. So you see that? So if you move over to the right, you see that's a difference of 47. So we would call that 47 the gap. Okay? So now you're starting to notice that you want that gap to become narrower as we move over time. So now by comparison, looking at 2019, you're going to see that our English learners are now at a -13. Everybody else has now gone above the line to 27, producing a gap of 40. So the difference between those two is 7 points, right? It's a 7-point decrease in the gap. Now, okay, you might be saying, so what? What does that mean? Does that mean anything? So by comparison, when we look at all the core districts, and we look at their data, they have actually increased their gap by 2 points. So this is really encouraging data. So we're able to compare our English learners to those who aren't in that group. We're able to look at the gap over time. We're able to compare it to how other core districts are doing. All right. So I'm going to take you now through the other ones, which are modeled exactly off of this one. So now that you got the first one, so that first one, as a reminder, that was elementary ELA. So now we're going to move into middle school ELA. And what do we see here? So again, we see starting at -69 in one group and -1, which is a gap of 68. When we move up to this past school year, we see -35 and 23, which is a gap of 58. We have closed the gap from 2015-16 to last year by 10 points. So again, how does that compare? The core districts have increased their gap by 6 points. So again, we feel like this is some really compelling data that shows movement. And again, what this does is it allows us to capture the movement of students, whether or not they actually become the proficient or what we call the meet or exceed level. It allows us to track progress along the way. So it shows some of that movement. High school slides. When we were making these slides and we had to get them ready and get them to print, the high school data was not all in with core, so we've given you preliminary slides in your addendum, but we'll have to give you some updated high school slides. Okay.
So Dr. Kale?
Yes.
I'm going to pause right
Pause.
there. Two questions for the deeper dive that we'll take later. One is I think the importance here of also attaching the actual raw number of ELs and non-ELs in the blue and the red, and I'm colorblind, so I'm just looking at left and right here. Because again, if our EL population is either dropping dramatically or increasing across these years, that certainly has impact. But the other is if there's a way to disaggregate another layer of this, not just non-EL RFEPs and the EL RFEPs within the subgroups. So the EL Latinx students and EL and RFEP Latinx students and the non-EL RFEP Latinx students. Because there's also the subgroup, there's a conflation of subgroups and some of those subgroups are flat as the data shows, so it exacerbates the analysis here if we're not able to disaggregate by Latinx EL RFEP students and non-Latinx EL RFEP students who may be flatlining from this data. So again, deeper dive, but there's subgroups that are either improving slightly or flatlined that this wouldn't necessarily demonstrate as well.
I can tell you that core allows us to look at the subgroup by ethnicity, but right now I'm not aware, without doing some additional analysis, separating ethnicity from EL out of the subgroup.
Right.
The subgroups seem to intersect. So that could be something
It
for...
might be interesting, right, to see that.
Definitely. All right, so that takes us to... yes. So elementary math. So in elementary math, without walking you through all the numbers, really what we're seeing, if we go down, you see started with a gap of 33, now at a gap of 27, so a 6-point reduction in the gap. Again, comparing it to the core districts, they saw an increase by 4. So again, encouraging data in elementary math. And then some, again, the same pattern here for middle school math. So the gap starts at 63, moves to 56. It's a 7-point reduction. And the core districts increase their gap by 9. So it's very, it's very compelling data in that respect. While we didn't make slides for every single subgroup, because we could be here all day, I can say that we are not necessarily seeing these same patterns across all subgroups. So the encouraging news here is that this really does show us that there's some progress that we haven't been able to look at closely in this particular group of students. So I'm going to transition us now back to my colleague Robert, who's going to start taking you through some of the readiness data and the concept of readiness.
This series of slides actually returns us back to a point that was made by Dr. Williams when he talked about the importance of closing that gap between 5th and 6th grade performance, which is this question of, well, how do we prepare our students for the next level? And it's really important for us to keep in mind that we have to take a very holistic approach as it relates to the concept of readiness. Readiness for middle school, readiness for high school, readiness for college, readiness for the world of work. We want to make sure that we take a holistic perspective. Up to this point, we focus primarily on performance in English language arts and math, including for various subgroups like English learners. But we know that student success is about more than just these two academic areas. We know that other subject areas also matter. We know that how engaged a student is at school matters. We know that the social emotional well-being of that student is also important. So we want to try to capture that as much as possible to the extent that we can with the various metrics that we have at our disposal. So it's about looking at the totality of the students, the whole child, but not just the whole child at a particular snapshot. It's about the whole child during the journey that they embark upon in their academic careers while they're here in our school system. That's at the heart of what we mean when we talk about the concept of readiness, how successfully we're preparing our students for the next level. This is the crux of why we have our college and career readiness guides, which attempts to show how our students are making progress toward college readiness as they go through 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. It's also now being deployed for our middle school students in the form of the high school readiness guides, which is where you see this graphic. It portrays the concept of ensuring that our students continually grow as they age throughout our school system. With high school readiness in particular, we're talking about these criteria: 96% or higher attendance, no suspensions, 2.5 plus GPA, and no D's or F's in English or in math. So these are very high standards. If a student fails to meet one of these standards, then at least by the definition of high school readiness, they are not considered high school ready. Even though it doesn't predetermine what their ultimate fate is going to be, it does ensure that we pay very close attention to many different areas of a student's academic and social emotional well-being throughout the school system. So now when we take this concept and we try to quantify it with our students, we look in particular at our 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students, and we see what percentage of them are meeting all of those criteria for high school readiness. We see that in 2018-19, 53% of our students in that group are demonstrating readiness. That is comparable to what it was last year. We had seen some growth in this area, but there's some leveling out that we've experienced over the past few years.
Robert, do we know what the biggest, if there's one of these areas in particular that seems to be the biggest barrier for when we look at that readiness?
That's a really good point. I think we'll see when we look at some of our attendance numbers that chronic absenteeism could be posing an issue for us when we look at the general trend in the district. Math is always a barrier because performance in mathematics can befuddle a student and put them off track. So that's another area. And then no suspensions is a really critical one. So just one suspension can put a kid off track, at least in terms of this metric. So we really try to set a very high bar for ourselves to ensure that kids are on track in every category. And we try to pay very close attention to all of those areas.
And Robert, also, for those students that are not on track and they don't meet these readiness standards, what do we do for those students?
It depends on the area where they are struggling, but what schools have now and that our research office has built are these basically watch lists, which help determine, you saw this in a presentation that was given to the board at the last board workshop, but basically schools have access to all of this data and it signals when a student might be at risk of falling out of the readiness realm. And then they can drill down into the specific area where a particular student may have some gaps. And then they will typically deploy an intervention to try to support that student. So if it's in math, it will be a math intervention. If it's Attendance related, then it could be additional counseling time, follow-ups with parents, a variety of different programs and interventions that schools may develop for the particular needs of that student.
So that's an example of how this data and keeping track of everything helps and informs what we do.
Absolutely, yes. So, when we think about it, students that are at risk, that's such a global term. We don't know, just by saying a student's at risk, which area that might be. So this really allows us to be much more fine-tuned about exactly what kind of support a student might need.
And another good example of using this data was last year, you as a board approved resources for our students in high school who are chronically absent for TAP cards. So we gave over 500 TAP cards to our high schools. And in some cases, the group reduced its chronic absenteeism by 50%. So it's huge, and so that program will be continue and be expanded this year. But that's another example of using that data and targeting it to certain students that needed that issue.
It would also be good to know when we get the update on what the impact of our scaled grading is having on the Ds and Fs as well, right? Yeah.
Here we break out high school readiness by ethnicity, and we see that generally stable results within a few percentage points of prior year results for most of the subgroups. I will highlight the Pacific Islander subgroup here. Saw tremendous gains, 4 percentage point gain over the past year and 11 percentage point gain over the past 4 years. So here's where it really pays off to try to look holistically at all of the data that we have, because we saw in prior slides that Pacific Islanders may not be growing at the same level as the other subgroups as it relates to SBAC results. But when we look a little bit more broadly at some of their other performance indicators, they actually show some gains. Now that allows us to fine-tune some of the services that we provide to that particular subgroup as well, which may be different than other subgroups. Here we break them out by additional subgroups. Again, generally stable results, more or less year to year. Shifting from high school readiness to college readiness, we look at a whole host of different metrics, as the board is well aware, starting with access, enrollment, participation, how students perform in college-level courses as measured by our advanced placement. And we've had a long-standing initiative in the district for AP participation and AP performance. We see this year 47% of our 11th and 12th graders are enrolled in at least one AP course, similar to what it was last year. We see it leveling out a little bit. And by ethnicity, when we look at our African American subgroup, we see gains, so 35% to 37% between 2017 and 2018. So even as the district overall has been flat, there have been some gains in terms of closing the achievement gap in various areas.
And Robert, before you go on, we need as a staff to give you the numbers of dual enrollment, because one reason this is flattening is because of the number of students taking dual enrollment. So in some cases, we have literally hundreds of students taking, instead of taking a history or an English class with us as an AP, they're taking that course at City College. And so we need to give you that data in the future, by high school and by subject matter of which of our students are taking this, because we have large numbers of students taking core classes, as you will know, over in the different community colleges. So,
when we look at other subgroups, we note here some really encouraging trends for our English learners and our RFEP students. So 41% to 43% in terms of their enrollment. A significant increase from 2014 when that rate was at 28%. So you see that it's been steady and in some cases accelerated growth for our EL and RFEP students, at least in terms of AP enrollment. Homeless foster youth has also increased year to year, as well as over the past 4 years. And our low socioeconomic group has also been increasing steadily since 2014. What this also shows us, however, is that huge gap between our female and our male students. So you'll note that female enrollment in AP is at 55% and males are at 39% just for this year. and that it's been a pretty pernicious gap that we're experiencing. So it's one area where we're continuing to explore different ways of engaging our male students in this program.
It is interesting that our SES increase went up 4%, but yet it's a little bit flatter by the race and ethnicity subgroups, even though more than 70% of our African American Latino students are SES students. So, any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Right, because homeless and foster youth went up 4% as well.
Right. I mean, if we looked at the second set of subgroups, it tells a little bit of a different story than the by race and ethnicity subgroups.
Here we shift from enrollment to taking a look at exams. And this is where, Dr. Benitez highlighted this in another slide, but the idea of knowing what the decline in enrollment looks like really does help to contextualize the numbers. So when you look at the bars, you'll note that there's actually a slight decrease in the number of exams for all grades, but that comes with the fact that there are actually decline in enrollment in the program, which also reflects a decline in enrollment for the district overall. So when you take all of that together and you piece it all together, actually shows it's a flat trend as opposed to an actual decline in terms of raw numbers. And that goes for both the tests that are taken as well as the exams that are passed. So the district has held steady at 43%. It's a couple of percentage points increase from 2016-17. But again, when it comes to AP performance on the exams, it's really important for us to remember that we have had an aggressive open access policy in the district. So some students that traditionally wouldn't be considered AP students, certainly nationwide wouldn't be considered AP students. We're really encouraging to access this program and to pay, in our case, we pay for their exams to the tune of $89 for every single exam that they take. So we're really heavily promoting participation and exposure of the students to these rigorous learning experiences. And that's going to have an effect on the overall percentages, but we think that it's worthwhile when we're seeing the participation numbers going up.
Can we get, Robert, the percent of exams taken versus just the past and then the run?
It's roughly 91%. We've been very consistent every year. About 91% of our students who are enrolled in AP courses take the exam.
Okay.
The last 4 or 5 years have been very consistent.
And has increased actually thanks to the board's support for the subsidy that the students have for those exams. Here's a breakdown by ethnicity. Again, you're seeing relatively flat trends, some growth here or there, some declines here and there, and similar for the subgroup data here as well. So this was readiness for college level type courses. Then we also look at just graduation in general, completion of the student's high school experience. We see a slight increase from 2017-18 to 2018-19, from 85 to 86% roughly. By ethnicity, we're seeing the following trends. You'll note that there's been a closure in the gap, particularly for African American students as it relates to their Caucasian counterparts, where in 2014 it was a 15% point gap. This year it's 6 percentage point gap. So there's been all of the efforts paid to ensuring that our African American students and our Hispanic students and all of the historically underachieving subgroups receiving services and interventions to ensure that they actually graduate, paying dividends for the students in these subgroups in terms of closing the achievement gap with their white counterparts. And then similarly for subgroup data here. seeing roughly similar trends as you're seeing in many areas. This naturally focuses just on our students in the district, but it's really important for the board and the community to also understand that while some of our progress may have slowed over the past couple of years, the district continues to outperform the state. So when we look at the state average as a benchmark in comparison to the state average, LBUSD's cohort grad rate is 3 percentage points higher than the state overall. Among African Americans, it's 12% higher compared to their peers throughout the state. Among Hispanics, we outperform by 4 percentage points against other Hispanic students throughout California. The gap for Pacific Islanders is higher for the district by 2 percentage points, by 5 percentage points among low SES students, and even by 1 percentage point among our English learners. So in terms of our subgroups and how they perform to their peers statewide, we are doing extremely well. And then when you compare it to the county data, it's even more favorable on the district side, in large part because there's one large district that occupies the county, and they tend to historically underperform compared to the students here in our district. Now this is the last section for us for today, and then we'll continue with the other readiness data tomorrow. But we really wanted to end on the note of the A through G completion rates because this has been a long-standing district priority. We've had a goal of 60% A through G completion for as long as we've been doing college and career readiness work in the district, for probably at least 10 years, if not longer. And we received a lot of pushback when we initially set out the 60% target because it was extremely high. At the time, the district was barely hovering around the low 30 percentage point mark. And there was a considerable anxiety amongst all stakeholders in the district, whether it's parents or students or staff, teachers, administrators, business partners, our higher education partners, who wondered whether it was an overly ambitious goal. But the board has committed to this particular goal throughout the entire time. And it really has paid off in terms of setting the bar high and having high standards for all of us to try to meet. Because what we see now is that the district has accomplished that goal for the very first time. So you'll note that 60% of our projected class of 2019 is estimated to reach that goal. For 2017-18, it's at 57%, representing an 8 percentage point increase. But if you look at the far left, just 2011 and 12, we were at 37% A through G completion rate. So from just that point forward, we saw such a rapid growth every single year, culminating in hitting this particular goal this year. So it's a real testament to all of the hard work that's taken place. And as has already been stated, this work doesn't just start overnight. In other words, it doesn't just encompass a high school achievement. It's actually an achievement for the entire school system, because in order for our students to be on track to meet A through G, our students have to be doing really well across all grade levels, starting when they come into us in preschool. So this is a tremendous system-wide accomplishment for us. By ethnicity, you'll see that there's growth across all of the subgroups. For African Americans, 3 percentage points, 4 percentage points for Hispanics, Pacific Islanders by 8 percentage points, etc. So it's a really strong testament, again, to trying to narrow the achievement gap in terms of ensuring that all students are achieving at this level. And then we see some gains as well by subgroup, whether we're looking at our special education students, where we're seeing 3 percentage point growth, our EL and RFEP students, where there's a 10 percentage point growth, homeless foster youth, 3 percentage point growth year to year, and our low SES students by 13 percentage points. So these are significant gains across many different subgroups. throughout the entire school system. And again, just as we did with the cohort grad rate, we compare ourselves to the state average, and we see that our A through G completion rate is 7 percentage points higher than the state overall. Our African American students are outperforming their statewide peers by the same degree, as well as the Hispanic students, and then our low SES students outperforming their statewide peers by 8 percentage points. So again, this is a strong testament to the hard work and efforts by all of us here in the district. And some of the schools to highlight with the biggest improvements include McBride, saw a 22 percentage point gain in their A through G completion rate. Wilson, 10 percentage point gain. Milliken, 8 percentage point gain, and Jordan, 6 percentage point gain. So you're seeing it all across the board in terms of growth and progress. Any questions on the A through G rate before we summarize for the day?
Yeah, I think the A through G growth is a tremendous thing for us to be highlighting. I appreciate you sharing that yesterday, Superintendent, through your slides. And because the A through G completion rate is so polemic across our state, I appreciate the comparison here at the state level. It would be interesting to see how we could, without it being a race, Mr. Superintendent, how we could compare to those districts, for instance, that decided to go A through G default curriculum. Okay.
We're very competitive, you'll see that.
Yeah.
In fact, in some cases, we beat them.
I know you're not passionate about this at all, Chris. Because then it really is key to look at best practices, right? Because if we don't have A through G default curriculum, some districts do. The opt-out for them is, okay, if we're doing better than those districts, then what are we doing without having an A through G default curriculum that even those districts that do have an A through G default curriculum are not able?
Right, and for those who are watching now or later, the A through G default means that in order to get a diploma, everyone must complete all A through G classes with a C or better. And if you don't, in the 11th grade, you have to make a decision, which means you default to go off of it, so you still can get a diploma, which we don't do. We do with the reverse. Everyone's placed on A through G as a 9th grader and continues unless he or she doesn't make up a D in a class. So it's a great, and we can get to those comparisons. So
Good.
And just to summarize for the day here, we tracked all of the metrics that you just saw and whether or not the goal was met in terms of the LCAP for this year. And you're seeing for ELA, the 3% overall growth, the math, 3% overall growth, the redesignation rate being above the state average, the increase in percentage meeting the ELA standards for our EL and RFEP students, and the A through G completion rate where we had set out the 60% target. All of those were met. In most other areas where we didn't meet a goal, we grew. So there were some positive indicators there, or we at least maintained. In one area for high school readiness, it was a slight decline, but we also saw that it had been increasing in previous years. So that's just to help us to kind of contextualize and take a bigger picture perspective. This gives us a really good snapshot of areas where we're continuing to perform really well, but also some areas where we can continue to improve. So hopefully that it helps the board and members of the community to get a really good sense of the overall performance of the district as it relates to our own plan.
Thank you, Robert and Christy, for such an excellent presentation. This is amazing stuff. Any additional questions from members of the board?
Thanks, Robert. I'm still concerned about that transition of young kids into 8th grade algebra and how we're falling short there. And I would guess that that probably explains our decline in high school readiness. So I would like us to take a closer look at what's happening in math in those lower grades to try to address that issue.
Yeah, I concur, John. I think the high school readiness for me, given that we're either meeting and or growing in the other areas, and if we're looking at attendance, that's, something that we're making a big push for. We have graded scale grading now, so the D's and F's and the GPA we should see the impacts of. So yeah, that's a little outlier for me as well.
And to add, I suspect that attendance is going to come into play with those kids that are suffering in math at the lower grades too. You miss a day of math,
Yes.
you know, it's tough to catch up. Other areas you can.
And also, when you look at the summer breaks and kids are out of school, again, we have a problem with maintaining what they've learned during the regular semester and having to come back in the fall and pick up.
Or if they're showing up hungry on Monday.
Yeah.
It might be interesting to look at, and just going back to my comment before, to look at each school or even region if we wanted to do it that way and see what the number one barrier is. What is attendance 39% of the problem in one area, but suspensions are that in another, and to kind of plot out if there's trends by school or if there's trends by area, because we might find out that it's a transportation issue. But just to look at what, I mean, that's always my question is, when they fall off A through G, what is the biggest barrier? Is it the math component? So when we look at that high school readiness, what continues to be the biggest barrier to high school readiness, and does it change depending on where you're going to school, what part of the city you may live in? I don't know that that's true, but I always find that looking at that data might be helpful in finding some trends that we can address.
Yeah.
Okay, Robert, Christie, thank you both
Thank you.
Thank
so
you,
much,
Robert.
very much, for excellent presentation.
How was your first official presentation, Christy?